ekaniteuji.sadboard.club. The evening of the third day brought an unexpected crisis. Emergency alarms echoed through the palace as news arrived that Dominion War Clan raiders had attacked a Veltar research station on the border. The assault appeared designed to test Imperial response time and resolve, exactly the kind of provocation that had started the last 3 border conflicts. Emperor Thanemore convened an emergency war council, and for the first time in years, Zarathel found herself invited to attend. The massive strategy chamber filled with military commanders, intelligence officers, and the heads of allied delegations. The holographic display showed the attacked station, one of her medical research facilities, burning in space. Preliminary reports indicate 17 researchers killed, including 3 from allied species, General Vextar announced grimly. The raiders took medical supplies and data before destroying the station's main laboratory. This is clearly a provocation, declared Ambassador Yilnara of the Kristek Union. They want us to respond with overwhelming force so they can claim justification for a larger war. The debate that followed was depressingly familiar to Zarathel. Some voices called for immediate military retaliation. Others urged diplomatic protests through consortium channels. A few suggested reinforcing border defenses and waiting to see if more attacks followed. All the responses were predictable. All had been tried before, and none had ever resolved the underlying problem. Marcus sat quietly through most of the discussion, studying the tactical displays with intense concentration. When Emperor Thanemore finally asked for his input, the human's response surprised everyone. "Your Majesty, could I see the personnel files for the research station? Specifically, what projects they were working on?" "I fail to see how that's relevant to our military response," General Vextar interjected. "Humor me," Marcus said politely. "Sometimes understanding the why helps clarify the how." Zarathel accessed the files and projected them for the room to see. The destroyed station had been working on 3 major projects: treatment for a degenerative genetic condition affecting multiple species, development of new food production techniques for resource-poor worlds, and research into neural interface technology that could help beings with various disabilities integrate more fully into galactic society. "Interesting targets," Marcus observed. "None of these projects have obvious military applications, but all of them directly threaten Dominion ideology about genetic superiority and survival of the strongest." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a random border raid. It was an attack on the very ideas that made the Veltar Empire different from militaristic powers like the Dominion. "What are you suggesting?" the Emperor asked. Marcus stood and approached the holographic display. "I'm suggesting that the Dominion made a critical error. They've just proven that they see Princess Zarathel's work as threatening enough to attack with military force. That tells us something important about how effective her approach really is." Zarathel felt the attention of the room shift to her, and for once it wasn't because of pity or embarrassment. "The projects they destroyed will be rebuilt," she said quietly. "But if we respond with conventional military action, we prove their point that might makes right. So we do nothing?" General Vextar demanded. "Let them think they can attack our people without consequence." "No," Marcus said with a slight smile. "We respond in a way they don't expect and can't counter." Over the next hour, Marcus outlined a plan that seemed almost insane by conventional military standards. Instead of striking back at Dominion military targets, he proposed a coordinated humanitarian mission to refugee camps in neutral space, camps filled with beings who had fled Dominion oppression over the years. The Veltar Empire would provide medical aid, food production technology, and educational support, all broadcast live across galactic communication networks. "This is madness," the Zephyrian ambassador protested. "You want to respond to an attack with charity work?" "I want to respond to an attack with victory," Marcus corrected. "But not the kind of victory the Dominion understands." The plan faced enormous resistance from traditional military thinking, but Emperor Thanemore was intrigued enough to authorize a small test mission. 3 ships would carry relief supplies and medical teams to the largest refugee camp, accompanied by human technical advisors who would help establish permanent infrastructure. Zarathel insisted on joining the mission personally, despite her father's concerns about security. "If we're going to demonstrate that the Veltar Empire values every being's dignity," she argued, "then I need to be there. My presence sends a message about what we truly believe." The journey to the refugee camp took 2 days through neutral space. During the trip, Zarathel worked closely with the human technical team and was amazed by their approach to problem solving. Where most species brought solutions designed for their own physiology and then tried to adapt them, the humans began by studying the needs of the refugees and designing from scratch. When they arrived at the camp, the scene was heartbreaking. Thousands of beings from dozens of species lived in makeshift shelters, surviving on minimal rations while trying to build new lives far from their homeworlds. Many bore the marks of genetic modifications forced on them by Dominion improvement programs. Others showed signs of malnutrition or untreated injuries. But as the relief mission began its work, something extraordinary happened. The refugees' response to seeing Princess Zarathel working alongside them, her obvious physical limitations making her struggles, with some tasks visible to all, seemed to give them hope in a way that no amount of charity from perfect beings could have achieved. She is like us, Zarathel heard one refugee whisper to another. Damaged but not broken. Still fighting. By the end of the first day, news of the mission was spreading across galactic communication networks. The contrast between the Dominion's destruction of a medical research station and the Empire's response of helping the most vulnerable beings in space created exactly the narrative Marcus had predicted. More importantly, the refugees weren't just receiving aid, they were contributing. Beings with unusual genetic modifications proved to have insights into problems the research teams had been struggling with for years. Former Dominion prisoners shared intelligence about military capabilities and strategic weaknesses. The camp was transforming from a place of despair into a center of innovation and resistance. On the third night, as Zarathel worked with a team of refugee engineers to design improved shelter systems, Marcus found her in the engineering tent. "How are you feeling about unconventional warfare now?" he asked with a gentle smile. She looked around at the bustling activity, former enemies working together, impossible problems being solved through cooperation, hope replacing despair in thousands of lives. "I'm beginning to understand why the Dominion sees this as a threat," she said. "We're not just helping refugees. We're proving their entire worldview wrong." "Now you're thinking like a human," Marcus said. "Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply showing people a better way to live." Outside the tent, the stars shone down on a camp that had become something unprecedented in galactic history. A place where strength was measured not by genetic perfection or military might, but by the willingness to help others become their best selves. The next morning brought chaos to the Veltar Palace. News had spread overnight that the human representative had bypassed protocol and spoken directly with Princess Zarathel. The other delegations were outraged, claiming improper conduct and demanding audiences with Emperor Thanemore. Her sisters seemed torn between curiosity and concern about what this might mean for their own negotiations. Zarathel found herself summoned to her father's private study, a place she rarely visited anymore. The Emperor sat behind his massive desk, carved from a single piece of star crystal, his expression unreadable. His skin showed the deep blue patterns that indicated serious contemplation among their people. "Daughter," he said without preamble, "explain to me what transpired between you and this human." She had expected this confrontation but still felt nervous under her father's penetrating gaze. "He came to speak with me about potential alliance between our peoples." Nothing inappropriate occurred. The Zephyrian delegation claims he's trying to circumvent proper diplomatic channels by approaching the lesser princess first. The Emperor's tone carried a hint of anger, though whether at the insult to his daughter or the disruption to the summit wasn't clear. "They suggest he's either ignorant of our customs or deliberately attempting to cause discord." "Perhaps," Zarathel said carefully. "He understands our customs better than they assume. A true alliance requires more than military treaties and trade agreements. It requires understanding between peoples." Emperor Thanemore studied his daughter with new attention. In the past, she had always been deferential during their rare meetings, accepting whatever decisions he made about her future without argument. This quiet confidence was something different. "What did you think of him?" he asked. "He's intelligent, well-informed. He spoke of things no other delegate has ever bothered to learn about our culture or our history, and—" She hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. "He treated me as if my opinions mattered." The Emperor's skin shifted to lighter shades as surprise replaced contemplation. "What do you know about humans, Zarathel?" "Very little. They're a relatively new species to achieve interstellar capability. Their territory is small but growing. They seem to have survived several extinction-level events on their homeworld, through cooperation and adaptation rather than raw strength." The Emperor activated his desk's holographic display, showing Marcus Chen's file. Marcus Chen, age 34 by their solar years. Advanced degrees in xenobiology, comparative cultures, and diplomatic relations. He served as first contact specialist for humanity's expansion into new sectors. His species fought a devastating war among themselves not long ago, then somehow unified their entire planet in less than 50 years. Military analysts say they punch well above their weight class when threatened. Zarathel leaned forward, studying the human's image. Even in the formal diplomatic photograph, she could see that same warmth in his eyes that had struck her the night before. "What troubles me," her father continued, "is that preliminary intelligence suggests humans value different traits than most consortium species. They seem to prize individual merit over genetic perfection, innovation over tradition, loyalty over political advantage. If that's true, then they might see value where others see only weakness," Zarathel finished quietly. A soft knock interrupted them. "Enter," the Emperor called. Marcus Chen stepped into the study, wearing formal diplomatic attire but still managing to look more approachable than most ambassadors. He bowed precisely in the Veltar style, showing both respect and cultural knowledge. "Your Imperial Majesty, I come to request formal permission to court Princess Zarathel, with the intention of proposing marriage alliance between the Terran Federation and the Veltar Empire." The directness of the statement stunned both Veltar. In their culture, such negotiations typically involved months of careful preliminary discussions, evaluation of genetic compatibility, and complex political calculations. No one simply announced their intentions so boldly. "You realize," the Emperor said slowly, "that such an alliance would be considered unusual by consortium standards. My daughter's condition makes her an unlikely choice for someone seeking to advance their political position." Marcus met the Emperor's gaze steadily. "Your Majesty, humanity has learned that strength comes in many forms. We've survived as a species not because we were the strongest or fastest or most genetically perfect, but because we learned to value every individual's contribution. Princess Zarathel has accomplished more for interspecies relations than most career diplomats. Her research has saved millions of lives across multiple worlds. Her cultural programs have prevented wars. If those aren't the qualities humanity should seek in an ally, then we've learned nothing from our own history." Emperor Thanemor's skin began showing the golden highlights that indicated deep interest. "And what would humanity offer in return for alliance with my daughter?" "Everything we have," Marcus replied without hesitation. "Our technology, our military support, our loyalty, our friendship. But more than that, we offer the chance for the Veltar Empire to be judged not by ancient prejudices about physical perfection, but by the true measure of a civilization, how it treats those who need protection most." Zarathel felt her hearts racing again. No one had ever spoken of her as if she were a prize to be won rather than a burden to be managed. The human was offering not just marriage, but vindication of everything she had tried to accomplish despite being overlooked and dismissed. "Father," she said softly, "I would like to accept this courtship." The Emperor looked between his daughter and the human who had just turned galactic politics on its head, with a simple declaration of intent. Outside, the sounds of other delegations conducting their elaborate negotiations drifted through the crystal walls. But in this room, two species were discovering that sometimes the most powerful alliances begin not with grand gestures, but with someone finally seeing worth where others had seen only weakness. "Very well," Emperor Thanemor said finally. "Let us see what humanity truly offers." Princess Zarathel pressed her face against the crystal viewing port of her tower chamber, watching the gleaming ships arrive for the annual consortium summit. Each vessel carried potential suitors from across the galaxy, all seeking alliance with the mighty Veltar Empire through marriage to one of the royal daughters. The irony wasn't lost on her that none of them came for her. The left side of her body bore the cruel marks of a childhood accident involving unstable quantum energy. Her arm hung twisted and mostly useless. Her leg dragged when she walked, and intricate scars traced lightning patterns across her violet skin. In Veltar society, physical perfection was considered a reflection of spiritual worth and political strength. A damaged princess was seen as a bad omen, unfit to produce strong heirs or represent imperial might. Her sisters, Kiranel and Viramis, were already entertaining delegations in the grand halls below. Both possessed the classic Veltar beauty, tall, graceful forms with unblemished skin that shifted color with their emotions, flowing tentacle-like hair that moved with ethereal grace, and eyes that sparkled like captured starlight. They would have their pick of powerful mates from dozens of worlds. Zarathel had stopped attending these gatherings years ago. The pitying glances, the poorly concealed disgust, and the way conversations died when she entered a room had worn down her spirit. Her father, Emperor Thanemore, loved her but understood political reality. A disabled daughter could not secure the military alliances and trade agreements the Empire desperately needed as hostile neighbors pressed their borders. A soft chime announced a visitor. Zarathel turned from the window expecting her personal aid with the evening meal. Instead, a figure in simple brown robes stood in her doorway. The being was shorter than most species represented at the summit, with pale skin, strange fur covering the top of his head, and the most unusual eyes she had ever seen, a warm brown color that seemed to hold depth and kindness rather than the calculating coldness she was accustomed to. "Your Highness," the stranger said, his voice carrying an odd accent she couldn't place. "I hope I'm not intruding. I am Marcus Chen, representing the Terran Federation. I was hoping we might speak." Zarathel's hearts, both of them as was normal for her species, began beating faster. No suitor had ever sought her out privately. They usually went through proper diplomatic channels or, more commonly, simply ignored her existence entirely. She gestured to a sitting area near the window, trying to keep the nervousness from her voice. "Please sit, though I should warn you, human Marcus Chen, that you may be wasting your time. I am not considered marriageable material by galactic standards." Marcus settled into the chair across from her, and she noticed he moved with an easy confidence, despite being in an alien environment. "Perhaps galactic standards are flawed," he said simply. "I've been studying the political and cultural histories of consortium member species for months in preparation for this summit. The Veltar Empire's greatest achievements, the peaceful integration of 17 different species, the most advanced medical research in known space, the cultural renaissance that produced art treasured across the galaxy. All of these happened during periods when your people valued wisdom and compassion over mere physical appearance." Zarathel blinked in surprise. Most beings barely knew basic facts about Veltar culture beyond their military capabilities and trade relationships. "You've done considerable research." "Knowledge is the foundation of respect," Marcus replied. "And from what I've learned, you yourself have contributed significantly to several of those achievements. The medical advances that extended lifespans for 3 species came from research you initiated. The cultural exchange programs that prevented 2 wars were your design. Yet you're hidden away in this tower while beings with half your intelligence, and none of your accomplishments are treated as prizes to be won." The princess felt her skin shifting to deeper shades of purple, a sign of intense emotion among her people. "How do you know about my work?" "Those projects were never officially credited to me." Marcus smiled, and she realized it was the first genuine smile directed at her in years. "Because I looked beyond the official reports. I spoke with the researchers, the diplomats, the artists who benefited from your programs. They remember. They know who really made those successes possible." For the first time in decades, Zarathel felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. But years of disappointment had taught her caution. "Why does this matter to you? What does humanity gain from showing interest in the Empire's disabled princess?" "Maybe," Marcus said quietly, "humanity gains the chance to ally with the most remarkable being in the consortium. Maybe we gain access to a mind that sees solutions others miss, a heart that values justice over profit, and a spirit that refuses to be broken despite years of being told it's worthless." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge, spanning an impossible chasm. Zarathel had spent so long seeing herself through others' eyes that she had forgotten she might have worth beyond her physical limitations. This strange human from a species she barely knew existed was offering her something no one ever had: recognition of her true value. The other delegations seek marriage alliances for strategic advantages. she said carefully. Military protection, trade agreements, territorial concessions. What would humanity ask for? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his brown eyes meeting her starlight ones directly. Partnership. Real partnership. Two civilizations working together not because they have to, but because they choose to build something better than either could achieve alone. As the twin moons of Veltar Prime rose outside her window, Princess Zarathel realized that for the first time in her life, someone was seeing not her disabilities but her possibilities. The humanitarian mission's success triggered a cascade of unexpected consequences across the galaxy. Within a week, 17 different species had requested permission to send aid to other refugee camps. The Christek Union announced new trade agreements specifically designed to benefit displaced populations. Even the normally isolationist ethereal communes began sharing advanced technology for sustainable development. But the Dominion war clan's response was swift and vicious. They launched simultaneous attacks on 3 more research stations while issuing a formal declaration that any empire showing genetic weakness would be considered an enemy of natural order. Ambassador Krelnoth delivered an ultimatum to the consortium. Either condemn the Veltar-Human alliance as a violation of species purity laws, or face the consequences of supporting defective governance. The crisis came to a head when Princess Zarathel received a personal challenge from Krelnoth himself. According to ancient Dominion tradition, she could settle the matter through single combat, with the winner's ideology being accepted as superior. If she refused, it would be taken as admission that her approach was cowardice disguised as compassion. The challenge was obviously designed to be impossible for her to accept. Zarathel's physical limitations made her incapable of matching a Dominion warrior in traditional combat. But when she discussed the situation with Marcus, his response was typically unexpected. "What if we accept the challenge but redefine the terms of combat?" he suggested. They were in her study, surrounded by reports from refugee camps that were now becoming permanent settlements and research centers. The transformation happening across neutral space was remarkable, but it would all be meaningless if the Dominion succeeded in framing it as weakness. "I don't understand," Zarathel said. "Combat is combat. Physical prowess, weapons skill, tactical superiority." "Only if you accept their definition," Marcus replied. "But what if real combat is about protecting what matters most? What if strength is measured by how much good you can accomplish, rather than how much destruction you can cause?" Over the next 3 days, they developed a proposal that shocked both empires. Princess Zarathel would accept Ambassador Krelnoth's challenge, but the combat would take place in the largest refugee camp. Each combatant would have 1 month to demonstrate their vision of strength and superiority. Krelnoth could use any methods he chose to prove Dominion ideology. Zarathel would counter with her own approach. At the end of the month, the refugees themselves would judge which vision had proven more powerful. The Dominion initially tried to reject these terms, claiming they weren't real combat. But the galactic media had seized on the story, and refusing to compete on equal terms made them look weak. Krelnoth was forced to accept or admit that Dominion warriors were afraid of a disabled princess. The contest began with Krelnoth arriving at the camp accompanied by a full military deployment. His strategy was straightforward: demonstrate overwhelming superiority through displays of advanced weaponry, perfect genetic specimens from Dominion worlds, and efficient resource distribution controlled by military hierarchy. He established a separate compound, where refugees could receive improved rations and medical care, but only if they submitted to genetic testing and accepted Dominion authority. Zarathel's approach was completely different. She moved into the camp's most basic shelter, and began working alongside refugees on their own projects. Instead of offering solutions from above, she asked questions about what they needed and helped them develop their own capabilities. When refugees showed her problems they couldn't solve, she connected them with experts from across the galaxy who could provide knowledge rather than dependence. The contrast was stark and immediate. Krelnoth's compound was orderly, efficient, and completely dependent on Dominion support. The areas where Zarathel worked were chaotic, experimental, and increasingly self-sufficient. More importantly, word of the competition was spreading. Scientists, engineers, artists, and innovators from hundreds of worlds began arriving to observe or participate. By the second week, something unprecedented was happening. The refugee camp was becoming the most diverse center of learning and innovation in galactic history. Beings who had been considered worthless by their original societies were solving problems that had stumped established research institutions. Former enemies were collaborating on projects that benefited everyone. Most remarkably, many of the refugees working with Zarathel began developing solutions to challenges in Krelnoth's compound, freely sharing their innovations, despite being rejected by the Dominion system. The turning point came when a group of refugees with various physical and cognitive differences, beings that Dominion ideology considered genetic failures, successfully designed and built a water purification system that was more efficient than anything in current galactic use. They offered to share the technology with both compounds, but while Zarathel immediately integrated it into her area, Krelnoth refused to accept technology developed by defective minds. By the third week, refugees were quietly abandoning Krelnoth's compound to join the collaborative community growing around Zarathel. The Dominion response was to increase security and restrict movement, which only highlighted the difference between systems based on control versus those based on trust. Marcus watched the developments with quiet satisfaction, but Zarathel found herself worried about the larger implications. "What happens when this is over?" she asked him one evening as they walked through the camp's new gardens. "Even if we win the refugees' support, the Dominion still has the largest military force in the galaxy. They won't accept ideological defeat peacefully." "That depends," Marcus said thoughtfully, "on whether this stays contained to one refugee camp." As if summoned by his words, a priority communication signal reached them. Emperor Thanemor's image appeared in holographic form, his expression showing an unprecedented mixture of amazement and concern. "Daughter," he said without preamble, "we have a situation. Refugee camps across 17 sectors are reporting the same phenomenon you've created there. More concerning, established colony worlds are beginning to request Veltar advisors to help implement similar collaborative approaches. The Consortium Council is demanding an emergency session to address what they're calling dangerous ideological contamination." Zarathel felt her heart's racing. "Father, I never intended to start a revolution," the Emperor interrupted with what might have been pride in his voice. "Perhaps it's time our galaxy had one." The transmission ended, leaving Marcus and Zarathel standing in a garden that refugees had built with their own hands, surrounded by the sound of dozens of species working together on projects that would have been impossible under the old systems of genetic hierarchy and military dominance. "Marcus," Zarathel said quietly, "what have we done?" He smiled and took her hand, the damaged one that she had always tried to hide. "We've given everyone permission to be their best selves," he said. "Now we get to see what happens when an entire galaxy decides that might not be such a bad idea." The humanitarian mission's success triggered a cascade of unexpected consequences across the galaxy. Within a week, 17 different species had requested permission to send aid to other refugee camps. The Christek Union announced new trade agreements specifically designed to benefit displaced populations. Even the normally isolationist ethereal communes began sharing advanced technology for sustainable development. But the Dominion war clan's response was swift and vicious. They launched simultaneous attacks on 3 more research stations while issuing a formal declaration that any empire showing genetic weakness would be considered an enemy of natural order. Ambassador Krelnoth delivered an ultimatum to the consortium: either condemn the Veltar-Human alliance as a violation of species purity laws, or face the consequences of supporting defective governance. The crisis came to a head when Princess Zarathel received a personal challenge from Krelnoth himself. According to ancient Dominion tradition, she could settle the matter through single combat, with the winner's ideology being accepted as superior. If she refused, it would be taken as admission that her approach was cowardice disguised as compassion. The challenge was obviously designed to be impossible for her to accept. Zarathel's physical limitations made her incapable of matching a Dominion warrior in traditional combat. But when she discussed the situation with Marcus, his response was typically unexpected. "What if we accept the challenge but redefine the terms of combat?" he suggested. They were in her study, surrounded by reports from refugee camps that were now becoming permanent settlements and research centers. The transformation happening across neutral space was remarkable, but it would all be meaningless if the Dominion succeeded in framing it as weakness. "I don't understand," Zarathel said. "Combat is combat. Physical prowess, weapons skill, tactical superiority. Only if you accept their definition," Marcus replied. "But what if real combat is about protecting what matters most? What if strength is measured by how much good you can accomplish, rather than how much destruction you can cause?" Over the next 3 days, they developed a proposal that shocked both empires. Princess Zarathel would accept Ambassador Krelnoth's challenge, but the combat would take place in the largest refugee camp. Each combatant would have 1 month to demonstrate their vision of strength and superiority. Krelnoth could use any methods he chose to prove Dominion ideology. Zarathel would counter with her own approach. At the end of the month, the refugees themselves would judge which vision had proven more powerful. The Dominion initially tried to reject these terms, claiming they weren't real combat. But the galactic media had seized on the story, and refusing to compete on equal terms made them look weak. Krelnoth was forced to accept or admit that Dominion warriors were afraid of a disabled princess. The contest began with Krelnoth arriving at the camp accompanied by a full military deployment. His strategy was straightforward: demonstrate overwhelming superiority through displays of advanced weaponry, perfect genetic specimens from Dominion worlds, and efficient resource distribution controlled by military hierarchy. He established a separate compound where refugees could receive improved rations and medical care, but only if they submitted to genetic testing and accepted Dominion authority. Zarathel's approach was completely different. She moved into the camp's most basic shelter and began working alongside refugees on their own projects. Instead of offering solutions from above, she asked questions about what they needed and helped them develop their own capabilities. When refugees showed her problems they couldn't solve, she connected them with experts from across the galaxy who could provide knowledge rather than dependence. The contrast was stark and immediate. Krelnoth's compound was orderly, efficient, and completely dependent on Dominion support. The areas where Zarathel worked were chaotic, experimental, and increasingly self-sufficient. More importantly, word of the competition was spreading. Scientists, engineers, artists, and innovators from hundreds of worlds began arriving to observe or participate. By the second week, something unprecedented was happening. The refugee camp was becoming the most diverse center of learning and innovation in galactic history. Beings who had been considered worthless by their original societies were solving problems that had stumped established research institutions. Former enemies were collaborating on projects that benefited everyone. Most remarkably, many of the refugees working with Zarathel began developing solutions to challenges in Krelnoth's compound, freely sharing their innovations, despite being rejected by the Dominion system. The turning point came when a group of refugees with various physical and cognitive differences, beings that Dominion ideology considered genetic failures, successfully designed and built a water purification system that was more efficient than anything in current galactic use. They offered to share the technology with both compounds, but while Zarathel immediately integrated it into her area, Krelnoth refused to accept technology developed by defective minds. By the third week, refugees were quietly abandoning Krelnoth's compound to join the collaborative community growing around Zarathel. The Dominion response was to increase security and restrict movement, which only highlighted the difference between systems based on control versus those based on trust. Marcus watched the developments with quiet satisfaction, but Zarathel found herself worried about the larger implications. "What happens when this is over?" she asked him one evening as they walked through the camp's new gardens. "Even if we win the refugees' support, the Dominion still has the largest military force in the galaxy. They won't accept ideological defeat peacefully." "That depends," Marcus said thoughtfully, "on whether this stays contained to one refugee camp." As if summoned by his words, a priority communication signal reached them. Emperor Thanemor's image appeared in holographic form, his expression showing an unprecedented mixture of amazement and concern. "Daughter," he said without preamble, "we have a situation. Refugee camps across 17 sectors are reporting the same phenomenon you've created there. More concerning, established colony worlds are beginning to request Veltar advisors to help implement similar collaborative approaches. The Consortium Council is demanding an emergency session to address what they're calling dangerous ideological contamination. Zarathel felt her heart's racing. Father, I never intended to start a revolution? The Emperor interrupted with what might have been pride in his voice. Perhaps it's time our galaxy had one. The transmission ended, leaving Marcus and Zarathel standing in a garden that refugees had built with their own hands, surrounded by the sound of dozens of species working together on projects that would have been impossible under the old systems of genetic hierarchy and military dominance. Marcus, Zarathel said quietly, what have we done? He smiled and took her hand, the damaged one that she had always tried to hide. We've given everyone permission to be their best selves, he said. Now we get to see what happens when an entire galaxy decides that might not be such a bad idea. The emergency consortium session convened aboard Nexus Station, the massive orbital platform that served as neutral ground for galactic governance. Representatives from every major power attended, but the atmosphere was unlike any diplomatic gathering in recorded history. The usual careful protocols and hierarchical seating arrangements had been disrupted by an unprecedented development. Refugee representatives and colony world advocates had been granted speaking rights for the first time ever. Ambassador Krelnoth had lost the challenge decisively. When forced to choose between the two systems demonstrated in the camp, 93% of refugees had voted for Zarathel's collaborative approach. More damaging to Dominion prestige, several Dominion citizens who had observed the competition had formally requested asylum, claiming they wanted to live in a society that valued their contributions rather than just their genetic purity. But the real crisis wasn't the symbolic defeat of one warrior, it was the speed with which similar movements were spreading across civilized space. The consortium's emergency analysis revealed that 47 different systems had already begun implementing collaborative governance models. Traditional power structures were being questioned on hundreds of worlds. Most alarming to established authorities, military recruitment was declining as young beings increasingly chose to join humanitarian missions rather than pursue traditional combat careers. Princess Zarathel sat in the Veltar delegation section, very aware that she was the focus of intense attention from representatives who had barely acknowledged her existence just weeks earlier. Some faces showed curiosity, others concern, and a few displayed outright hostility. Beside her, Marcus maintained his usual calm demeanor, despite being the first human to ever address a full consortium assembly. The session began with Consortium Chancellor Vexidun calling for order. We face an unprecedented challenge to galactic stability, he announced. What began as a minor diplomatic arrangement has somehow evolved into systematic disruption of established governance models. We must determine whether this collaborative revolution represents progress or a threat to civilized order. The debate that followed revealed deep divisions among consortium members. The ethereal communes praised the new approaches for their emphasis on spiritual growth and mutual aid. The merchant guilds expressed concern about disruption to established trade relationships, but admitted that some collaborative colonies were producing innovations at remarkable rates. Military powers like the Zephyrian hegemony demanded immediate action to restore traditional hierarchies before chaos spread further. When Princess Zarathel was finally called to address the assembly, she found herself speaking to beings who controlled the fate of trillions of lives. Her voice was steady despite her nervousness. Honored representatives, she began, I understand the concern about rapid change, but I ask you to consider what we've actually accomplished. In 6 weeks, former enemies have become collaborative partners. Refugees have transformed from burdens into innovators. Colonies that were struggling with resource shortages are now achieving sustainability. Wars that seemed inevitable have been prevented through cooperation rather than threat of force. Pretty words, interrupted Ambassador Yilnara. But what happens when this idealistic experiment meets real galactic threats? The Void Dancers are still probing our outer territories. The Machine Concordat shows no signs of peaceful intentions. How does cooperation defend against beings who only understand strength? Marcus rose to respond, and Zarathel felt a moment of concern about how the assembly would react to humanity's representative. Honored Ambassador, he said respectfully, humanity has some experience with that question. We faced potential extinction from hostile forces more than once. Our survival didn't come from being the strongest or most genetically perfect. It came from being the most adaptable, the most willing to learn from others, and the most committed to protecting everyone in our community. Your species is barely a century into space travel, Chancellor Vexidun pointed out. What can you possibly teach civilizations that have maintained order for millennia? Perhaps, Marcus replied. We can teach you that order and progress aren't the same thing. Your current system has maintained stability, yes, but at what cost? How many innovations were never developed because their creators were considered genetically inferior? How many conflicts continued because compromise was seen as weakness? How many problems went unsolved because cooperation was viewed as idealistic nonsense? The chamber erupted in heated discussion. Representatives argued about military necessity, economic stability, and cultural preservation. But gradually a new voice began to emerge. Refugees and colony advocates, who had been granted speaking rights, were sharing their experiences with both traditional governance and the new collaborative approaches. Dr. Kethmar, a former Dominion scientist who had been exiled for questioning genetic purity laws, provided the most compelling testimony. I spent 30 years developing weapons for the war clans, he said. My research was considered valuable because it could kill efficiently. But when I was allowed to work with diverse minds on humanitarian projects, we solved in 6 months medical problems that had stumped specialists for decades. The difference wasn't our intelligence, it was our freedom to think beyond predetermined limitations. As the debate continued, reports kept arriving from across the galaxy. The collaborative colonies were experiencing unprecedented success in everything from agricultural production to conflict resolution. More concerning for traditional powers, military recruitment was plummeting while applications to join humanitarian missions soared. Young beings across hundreds of worlds were choosing cooperation over conquest. The turning point came when an emergency alert reached the assembly. A massive solar flare had damaged critical systems on 3 different worlds, threatening millions of lives. The disaster required immediate coordinated response from multiple species with different technological capabilities. Under traditional consortium protocols, such a crisis would require weeks of negotiations to determine responsibility, resource allocation, and command structure. But the collaborative networks that had grown from Zarathel's refugee camp were already responding. Ships from dozens of worlds were converging on the disaster zones, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to help. This is unprecedented, Chancellor Vexidun admitted as he watched the response unfold. We're seeing coordination without central command, resource sharing without formal treaties, and tactical adaptation happening in real time across multiple species. That's what happens, Zarathel said quietly, when beings trust each other enough to focus on solutions instead of politics. The rescue operation's success provided a powerful demonstration of collaborative principles in action. Lives were saved, resources were used efficiently, and new technologies were developed on the fly through unprecedented cooperation. Most importantly, the response had been faster and more effective than any traditional military or government operation could have achieved. As the emergency session drew to a close, it became clear that the galaxy had reached a crossroads. The old systems of genetic hierarchy, military dominance, and competitive resource control were being challenged by something entirely new. A model based on mutual aid, inclusive innovation, and the radical idea that every being had valuable contributions to make. The question before us, Chancellor Vexidun concluded, is not whether this change will continue. It's already spread too far to stop. The question is whether we will guide this transformation or be swept aside by it. Princess Zarathel looked around the chamber at faces that showed confusion, fear, hope, and determination in equal measure. The galaxy was changing, and there would be no going back to the way things were. The only question now was whether that change would be peaceful or catastrophic. Outside the station's viewports, ships from the successful rescue mission were departing for their home systems, carrying with them proof that cooperation could achieve what competition never had. The age of genetic perfection and military supremacy was ending. The age of collaborative strength was just beginning. 6 months after the consortium emergency session, Princess Zarathel stood in the ceremonial gardens of Veltar Prime, preparing for a wedding that would have been impossible under the old galactic order. Representatives from over 200 worlds had come to witness not just the marriage of a human and a Veltar, but the formal establishment of the Collaborative Alliance, a new form of interstellar governance based on mutual aid rather than military dominance. The transformation had not been without challenges. The Dominion war clans had attempted 3 separate military campaigns to restore proper order, only to discover that their traditional divide-and-conquer tactics were useless against societies that actually supported each other. Zephyrian forces found themselves surrounded not by enemy fleets but by rescue ships offering humanitarian aid to Dominion civilians suffering under military rule. It was difficult to maintain warrior morale when your supposed enemies kept trying to help your people. More fundamentally, the collaborative colonies had solved the resource scarcity that drove most galactic conflicts. When every world contributed its strengths and shared its innovations freely, artificial shortages that had justified warfare for centuries simply disappeared. The economic incentives that had maintained the old power structures were dissolving as rapidly as the political ones. Marcus approached through the garden paths, wearing formal diplomatic attire that somehow still managed to look casual and approachable. Behind him walked a procession unlike any in galactic history. Refugees who had become researchers, former enemies now serving as close advisors. Beings whose genetic imperfections had proven to be unique advantages in collaborative societies. Any second thoughts? He asked Zarathel with a gentle smile as he took her hands, both of them, damaged and whole alike. About marrying you? Never. She squeezed his fingers, marveling at how such a simple gesture could contain so much hope. About changing the entire galactic order? Perhaps a few. Emperor Thanemor stepped forward to officiate the ceremony, his skin showing the golden patterns of deep contentment. Daughter, when you were born with physical limitations, I feared you would never find your place in our world. I never imagined you would help create a new world where everyone could find their place. The ceremony itself blended traditions from dozens of species, creating something entirely new while honoring ancient customs. When the moment came for vows, Zarathel found herself speaking not just to Marcus, but to the assembled representatives of a galaxy in transition. I promise to love you not despite our differences, but because of them, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the garden. I promise to build with you a future where strength is measured by how much we lift each other up, not by how much we can tear down. Marcus's response brought tears to beings who had never thought they would witness such words spoken in a political context. I promise to see in you always what I saw from the first day, not limitation but possibility, not weakness but a different kind of strength, not someone to be protected, but someone to build the future alongside. The formal joining was witnessed by Dr. Kethmar, now heading the galaxy's first collaborative research institute, by former refugees who had become leaders of thriving colonies, by military officers who had chosen to become peacekeepers and humanitarian coordinators. Most meaningfully to Zarathel, it was blessed by her sisters, who had both chosen to join the collaborative movement and were now serving as ambassadors to worlds, considering the transition. But the real celebration began when the formal ceremonies ended and the assembled delegates shared what they had accomplished in just 6 months of collaborative governance. Agricultural worlds reported food surpluses for the first time in generations. Medical research was advancing at unprecedented rates as minds from different species collaborated freely. Art and culture were flourishing as beings previously considered inferior contributed perspectives that enriched everyone's understanding. Most remarkably, the number of active conflicts across known space had dropped to the lowest level in recorded galactic history, not because they had been suppressed by superior force, but because the underlying causes, resource competition, territorial disputes, ideological conflicts, were being resolved through cooperation rather than conquest. As the celebration continued into the evening, Zarathel found herself in conversation with Chancellor Vexidun, who had arrived to formalize the consortium's recognition of the collaborative alliance. I must admit, he said, his typically stern demeanor softened by what might have been admiration, I expected this experiment to collapse within weeks. Competition and hierarchy have governed galactic relations for millennia. The idea that cooperation could be more effective seemed naive. What changed your mind? Zarathel asked. The results, he replied simply. When beings freely choose to work together rather than being forced to compete, they accomplish things that seemed impossible under the old systems. Your approach hasn't just succeeded, It's made our previous methods look primitive by comparison. Near midnight, as the last guest departed and the gardens grew quiet, Marcus and Zarathel found themselves alone under the twin moons of Veltar Prime. The bioluminescent flowers around them glowed with soft, warm light in response to their contentment. "Do you think it will last?" Zarathel asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "This new way of doing things?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think we've proven something that can't be unlearned," he said finally. "We've shown that beings accomplish more when they're valued for who they are, rather than judged for what they lack. That societies thrive when they include everyone rather than excluding the imperfect. That strength comes from lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. Even if some try to return to the old ways, even then, because now there's an alternative that actually works better. And beings who have experienced real cooperation, real inclusion, real mutual respect, they don't easily go back to systems based on fear and domination." Zarathel smiled, thinking of the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. Colonies achieving sustainability, research breakthroughs happening weekly, conflicts being resolved through dialogue, young beings choosing collaboration over conquest. The transformation was accelerating, spreading to worlds that had never heard of the disabled Veltar princess, or the human who had seen value where others saw only weakness. "My father was right about one thing," she said softly. "I never did find my place in the old world." "No," Marcus agreed, pulling her closer. "You did something better. You helped create a new world where everyone could find their place. Above them, the stars shone down on a galaxy in the midst of the most profound transformation in its history. The age of genetic perfection and military supremacy was ending, not with conquest or collapse, but with the simple, revolutionary recognition that every being, however damaged, different, or supposedly defective, had something valuable to contribute. And in the gardens of Veltar Prime, surrounded by flowers that bloomed in response to hope and love, a disabled princess and a human who had dared to whisper, 'Be mine,' watched the dawn of an era where those words might finally apply to everyone.